In June 2014, China's foreign exchange reserves reached nearly $4 trillion. That number alone meant China held more liquid cash than the entire gross domestic product of Germany, the world's fourth largest economy. But here's what most people missed. China didn't stop there. According to research by Brad Setzer, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, China has accumulated an additional $3 trillion in what experts now call shadow reserves, foreign currency holdings hidden across state-owned banks and financial institutions. That brings China's total strategic advantage to approximately $6 trillion in deployable financial power. While Western banks were leveraging themselves to the breaking point in 2008, Lehman Brothers operated at leverage ratios approaching 44-1, and Bear Stearns collapsed with leverage of 36-1. China was quietly building the largest financial fortress in human history. This wasn't luck. This was a deliberate strategy that began decades earlier, refined through careful observation of every Western financial crisis, and executed with precision that Wall Street never saw coming. The question isn't whether China outsmarted the West. The evidence is undeniable. The question is, how did they do it, and what does it mean for the economic order we thought was permanent? This is the story of the greatest strategic financial play of the modern era. To understand China's financial strategy, you have to go back to July 1944. At the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, 44 nations agreed to a new international monetary system. They pegged their currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. This arrangement made the United States the anchor of global finance. For nearly 3 decades, this system held. But on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold. The Nixon shock, as it became known, fundamentally changed the rules. The dollar was no longer backed by hard assets. It became a fiat currency, backed only by trust in the U.S. government and the strength of the American economy. This created what economists call the exorbitant privilege. The United States could print money to finance deficits because the dollar remained the world's reserve currency. Other nations had to earn dollars through trade surpluses and hold them as reserves. This asymmetry defined the global financial architecture for the next 50 years. But China studied this system and identified its fundamental vulnerability. The entire structure depended on continuous trust and continuous demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. If that trust wavered, or if an alternative emerged, the system could fracture. China's leaders drew lessons from history. They watched the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 1998 devastate Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and Malaysia. Those countries had inadequate foreign exchange reserves when hot money fled their economies. The International Monetary Fund imposed harsh austerity conditions in exchange for bailout funds. China's reserves at that time stood at just over $140 billion. That crisis taught Beijing a critical lesson. In the modern financial world, reserves equal sovereignty. Without massive reserves, you're at the mercy of Western financial institutions and their conditions. The Chinese strategy crystallized around 3 principles. First, accumulate foreign currency reserves on a scale never before attempted. Second, diversify those reserves across multiple asset classes and institutions to prevent detection and political pressure. Third, use those reserves not for consumption, but as strategic ammunition to build alternative financial infrastructure that could eventually rival Western dominance. On December 11, 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization after 15 years of difficult negotiations. This was the inflection point. China's WTO accession opened access to Western markets on an unprecedented scale. The results were staggering. According to Federal Reserve research, certain categories of Chinese exports grew 220% from 2001 through 2007. China became the factory of the world. But unlike other export-driven economies, China didn't use its trade surpluses to buy foreign goods or let its currency appreciate. Instead, the People's Bank of China intervened massively in currency markets. Here's how it worked. When Chinese exporters earned dollars, euros, or yen, the central bank bought those foreign currencies with newly printed yuan. This kept the yuan artificially cheap, making Chinese exports more competitive. But it also meant China accumulated foreign exchange reserves at a breathtaking pace. In 2000, before WTO entry, China's reserves stood at approximately $165 billion. By the end of 2006, reserves had exploded to over $1 trillion. By 2013, they exceeded $3.8 trillion. At their peak in June 2014, China held just under $4 trillion, the highest foreign exchange reserves of any country in history. Compare this to the Western banking model during the same period. Major investment banks pursued a completely different strategy. They used leverage, borrowing money to amplify returns on investments. In 1998, Bear Stearns operated with leverage of 35-1. By 2006, that leverage had actually decreased slightly to 28-1. but the bank's balance sheet had grown massively. By the end of 2007, Bear Stearns held $395 billion in assets, supported by just $11.1 billion in equity, leverage of approximately 36 to 1. Lehman Brothers was even more extreme, with hedge fund manager David Einhorn calculating that if measured properly, Lehman's leverage reached 44 to 1. This wasn't just about leverage. Western banks had fundamentally changed their business model. They weren't holding loans on their books until maturity. They were originating mortgages, packaging them into complex securities, selling them to investors, and earning fees at every stage. The notional value of derivatives markets exploded into the hundreds of trillions of dollars. Banks were interconnected through counterparty risk in ways that regulators barely understood. When housing prices stopped rising in 2006, the entire structure began to crack. In March 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed and was acquired by J.P. Morgan Chase in a fire sale backed by $29 billion in Federal Reserve guarantees. 6 months later, on September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The bankruptcy triggered a global freeze in credit markets. Financial institutions didn't know which counterparties might fail next, so they stopped lending to each other. The system was on the verge of complete collapse. The United States government responded with emergency measures that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The Troubled Asset Relief Program allocated $700 billion to purchase toxic assets and inject capital into failing banks. According to research by MIT professor Deborah Lucas, the total direct cost of crisis-related bailouts on a fair value basis reached approximately $498 billion, or 3.5% of GDP in 2009. But other analyses paint a more dramatic picture. According to a Better Markets report, the 6 largest U.S. banks received approximately $8.2 trillion in bailouts through a bewildering array of emergency programs created by the Federal Reserve and Treasury. While Western banks were collapsing and begging for government bailouts, China was watching and accumulating. In the fourth quarter of 2013 alone, the People's Bank of China's foreign exchange reserves grew by $157 billion. This wasn't speculation or financial engineering. This was the result of China running persistent trade surpluses and systematically converting those surpluses into strategic reserves. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. China didn't just accumulate reserves, it built parallel financial infrastructure designed to operate independently of Western institutions. In 2007, China established the China Investment Corporation, a sovereign wealth fund initially capitalized with approximately $200 billion. As of December 2024, according to its annual report, CIC's total assets reached $1.57 trillion. This makes it one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, managing investments across global equity markets, fixed income, alternative assets, and real estate. But CIC is just the visible part. The State Administration of Foreign Exchange, known as SAFE, manages China's official foreign reserves. According to Brad Setzer's research published in June 2023, SAFE and other state-owned entities hold approximately $3 trillion in additional foreign assets that don't appear in the official reserve figures reported by the People's Bank of China. These shadow reserves are held through state-owned commercial banks, policy banks, and other financial institutions. This structure serves 2 purposes. It obscures the true scale of China's financial power, and it distributes holdings to avoid single points of vulnerability. China has also systematically accumulated strategic commodities. According to reports from multiple sources, the People's Bank of China resumed gold purchases at the end of 2022 after 3 years of inactivity, adding 62 tons in November and December alone. But research from Kitco News and other analysts suggests China's off-the-books gold purchases are approximately 10 times higher than official figures. China now controls approximately 92% of global rare earth processing capacity, according to the International Energy Agency. In October 2025, China announced further export controls on rare earth elements and related products, a strategic move that sent shockwaves through global supply chains for technology, defense, and renewable energy industries. Infrastructure investment became another weapon. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. From 2013 to 2021, China provided $679 billion for infrastructure projects across over 140 countries, according to a Government Accountability Office report. In 2024 alone, BRI engagement reached a record $70.7 billion in construction contracts and approximately $51 billion in investments. The first half of 2025 saw even higher numbers, $66.2 billion in construction contracts and $57.1 billion in investments. Compare this to the World Bank's infrastructure lending, and you see a fundamental shift in who finances the developing world's growth. In 2015, China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a direct alternative to the Western-dominated World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The AIIB launched with 57 founding members. The United States notably refused to join. As of 2025, the AIIB has 106 member countries. China holds approximately 27% of voting shares, making it the largest shareholder. Research shows that in countries where both institutions operate, the AIIB's presence reduced World Bank infrastructure projects by an average of 22%. Perhaps most strategically, China is developing the digital yuan, officially known as the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System. China became the first major economy to launch a central bank digital currency. This isn't just about modernizing payments. A digital yuan integrated with China's cross-border interbank payment system could provide an alternative to SWIFT, the US dollar-dominated messaging system that underpins international financial transactions. If China can convince trading partners to settle transactions in digital yuan, it could gradually erode the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Now consider China's position with US Treasury bonds. As of early 2025, China holds approximately $761 billion in US Treasuries, according to Treasury Department data. Though other estimates, including Brad Setzer's research, suggest the true figure is closer to $1.2 trillion when accounting for holdings through offshore entities. This has led to speculation about China weaponizing its treasury holdings, dumping bonds to drive up US interest rates in crash markets. But that analysis misses the point. China's real power isn't in dumping treasuries. It's in having accumulated enough reserves that it doesn't need to buy more. China can run independent monetary policy, intervene in currency markets, finance global infrastructure, and build alternative institutions, all without relying on Western banks or approval. This is financial independence at a scale never before achieved. The implications extend far beyond balance sheets. We're witnessing the emergence of a multipolar financial system. For 70 years, the Bretton Woods framework and its dollar-centric successor defined how global finance operated. That monopoly is ending, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual erosion as alternatives emerge. Consider what happens when developing countries face infrastructure funding gaps. Previously, they had two options: borrow from the World Bank with policy conditions attached, or borrow from private markets at high interest rates. Now they have a third option: Chinese financing through the Belt and Road Initiative or the AIIB. These loans often come with fewer political conditions, but create different forms of dependency through debt levels and strategic asset control. The dollar's role as reserve currency has provided the United States with enormous advantages. It means foreign central banks have to hold dollars, creating automatic demand for treasury bonds, which keeps U.S. borrowing costs low. It means American companies can do business globally without currency risk. It means the U.S. can impose financial sanctions that cut countries off from the global system. But every one of these privileges depends on the dollar remaining indispensable. If the digital yuan gains traction, if more trade gets settled in renminbi, if more reserves shift away from dollars, that indispensability diminishes. Western banks face a different challenge. The 2008 crisis led to massive regulatory reforms through Dodd-Frank and Basel III. Banks now hold more capital and face stricter leverage limits. These are necessary safeguards, but they also mean Western banks are less competitive against Chinese state-owned banks that operate under different rules and answer to different incentives. When China's largest banks make strategic loans to support Belt and Road projects, they're not primarily optimizing risk-adjusted returns. They're advancing state objectives. Western banks competing on purely commercial terms find themselves at a systemic disadvantage. The reserve accumulation strategy itself creates tensions. When China runs persistent trade surpluses and accumulates foreign exchange reserves, that requires other countries to run deficits. The United States has been the primary deficit country, absorbing Chinese exports and providing the dollars that China accumulates. This arrangement worked when it was viewed as temporary, but 4 decades later, it's clear this isn't temporary. It's a structural feature of the global economy, and structures that become unsustainable eventually break. Here's the insight that most analysis misses. China didn't outsmart Western banks through superior financial engineering or more sophisticated models. China won by doing the opposite. While Western banks embraced complexity, leverage, and short-term returns, China pursued simplicity: accumulate reserves, invest in hard assets and infrastructure, build parallel institutions, and play the long game. The $6 trillion advantage, $3.3 trillion in official reserves plus approximately $3 trillion in shadow reserves, represents the largest peacetime accumulation of financial resources in history. This wasn't achieved through military conquest or resource extraction. It was achieved by selling manufactured goods, maintaining an undervalued currency, and systematically converting trade surpluses into strategic reserves instead of consumption. The pattern reveals something profound about different approaches to economic power. Western banks optimized for quarterly earnings, shareholder returns, and bonuses tied to short-term performance. This created incentives to maximize leverage and take risks that generated immediate profits, but created systemic fragility. When the crisis hit, Western governments had to bail out private banks because letting them fail would have destroyed the entire economy. China's state-directed model avoided this trap. Chinese banks serve state objectives. If they make bad loans to infrastructure projects that don't generate commercial returns, the state absorbs the losses. This creates different problems: inefficiency, misallocation of capital, reduced innovation. But it doesn't create systemic collapse. The uncomfortable truth is that China observed how the US-dominated financial system works and designed a strategy specifically to exploit its vulnerabilities. The system depends on everyone continuing to trust dollar-denominated assets. China accumulated enough dollars to give itself independence from that system. The system depends on developing countries having no alternatives to Western institutions. China built those alternatives. The system depends on control of strategic resources and supply chains. China systematically acquired that control. This doesn't mean China's approach is superior in all dimensions. China faces enormous challenges: a rapidly aging population, massive local government debt, a property sector in crisis, and the inherent inefficiencies of state-directed capital allocation. But in the specific domain of accumulating strategic financial power while avoiding dependence on Western banks, China's strategy has been extraordinarily effective. The real question isn't whether China outsmarted Western banks. The evidence says yes. The real question is what comes next. Will the United States and its allies adapt by reducing deficits, rebuilding industrial capacity, and creating more resilient financial systems? Or will the gradual erosion of dollar dominance continue until we wake up one day to discover the rules have fundamentally changed? History suggests that transitions between dominant powers and dominant currencies are rarely smooth. They're usually accompanied by conflict: economic, political, and sometimes military. China's $6 trillion advantage didn't emerge overnight. It was built over 4 decades through patient accumulation, strategic positioning, and learning from every Western financial crisis. The advantage is real. The question is whether the West understands it in time to respond.